Hello, this is Rebecca from RebeccaWoodhead.com, and this is an interview for the New Author blog with some questions that Brian Knight sent to me that I thought might be fun if I just replied in my own voice rather than sending text replies. So, Brian, your first question that you asked me was, first, tell the readers a bit about you, why and when you began writing. I grew up in a medieval farmhouse near Cirencester, in a part of England called the Cotswolds, which, if you've been following the hype about the royal wedding, is the area that Prince Charles lives in. So Prince William spends a lot of time around here, and Cirencester is the place where he plays polo, and so does Harry. I grew up loving writing. I just loved writing. I loved writing stories, and when I was tiny I loved the idea that Celts and Romans had walked through the same fields as me. But as I got older, I started to notice more subtle things about the area, like the mechanics of the way that the class structure works here. And I'd watch grown-ups discussing things with smiling faces, but I'd hear point scoring, and it was like psychological tennis to me. If you've never been here, if someone throws banter at you in England, you have to be able to throw it back, or you're just spoiling the game. Learning that and realising that it's not just about, it's not just what a lot of our class structure is supported by, but it's also what makes our humour so resilient, was a real process for me when I was growing up. And learning that trick of language and humour that seemed to me as a child to be sort of artificial and controlling, learning that it's actually kind of fun once you get the hang of it, and it's actually it's a skill, and it's this kind of a national pastime. That was quite a revelation. It's also a strategy for breaking through social boundaries, which might sound odd because it's used to define them, but it's also used to break through them, and it connects people from different backgrounds, which I could see would be really useful as a kind of plot device. But I always knew that I would end up writing novels that included that humorous aspect of English culture and included the kind of nuances of the class structure, because it's so English, and it just doesn't play out in quite the same way elsewhere. And also those linguistic battles that happen all the time, particularly in the Cotswolds. And when I started reading more grown-up literature as I got older, and I was reading the work of others from this area, like Shakespeare and Jane Austen, and then people like Gilly Cooper and Joanna Trollope, I realised that their writing was fuelled by the same thing. And it took a while for me to notice they were all local to this area. And then other writers I was inspired by were very heavily influenced by writers from this area. And then suddenly I had this light bulb moment, and I realised that this is the archetypal home of English class wars, and that it's perennial, it doesn't change, and it's fascinating to people way beyond our kind of boundaries here, and way beyond the area, way beyond the country, and it remains fascinating historically. And it makes sense to address that if you notice something about your culture and you can see it as an insider and an outsider, which I was able to do once I'd moved away and lived in America, then it makes sense to write about it. I mean, I was able to see it anyhow before living in a different country, but it kind of throws it into sharp relief when you go and live somewhere that doesn't have that kind of system. And yeah, there's an awareness of there's positioning and stuff that happens in America, but it's nowhere near what we have going on here. And then you come back over here and it's like, it gives you brain ache. Why do people not say what they mean? And it's really quite a complicated system, and you don't realise it until you've been away from it for a bit. But anyway, when you notice something like that, when you notice something that's specific to your culture, it makes sense to write about it, I think. And I have a bit of a theory about why this has happened in this particular area, and it's actually not unconnected to the relationship between the Celts and Romans here, which was hugely profitable and actually not the warlike relationship you might think, but actually very cooperative in this specific area. The Celts influenced Roman art in this area, and the Romans brought cultural attention and technology. And it made this tiny little place, Cirencester, or Corinium as it was then, the second most important city in the country. And I don't think it's ever got its sense of proportion back since then, to be honest. But also the idea that art and creativity and crafts are important hasn't gone. So growing out of this, you have this parallel of the hierarchy that's set in place by farming, the farming nature of the area with landowners and farmers and labourers, the mansions and the servants and all the rest of it. But parallel to that, you've got this kind of creativity and art, and artists and artisans and writers and bohemians weaving their way through all of the layers, and this kind of academia and stuff as well, which has grown up through places like Oxford, and it makes for a really interesting and detailed canvas, and it's a great place to write about and to live in. For that reason. The next question is, when I met you, you simply went by RW and were rather shy. Now you're all over the social network scene. How did that change take place? I was terrified when I met you, Brian. I've been badly bullied, basically, is the truth, and I was really nervous about embracing the idea of online networks in case I got launched at again. So I'd become a bit of a hermit. It really kind of affected me psychologically, and I was very protective of my privacy. So blogging was a huge step for me. But once I got into it, I couldn't stop. And after I won the Miss Twitter UK contest, just too many people knew me for me to become anonymous again, so I had to just keep going. The next question. What's the most interesting thing about you that you believe has helped you grow as a writer, and why? The thing people tell me they find interesting about my history is that I'm a coma survivor, and that I taught myself to read and write without the help of a speech therapist or counsellor, and then went on to become an author and columnist. That's just brilliant practice for being a writer. So, that obviously that helped me to grow as a writer, because I had to kind of learn that whole process of language again, and I had to learn to work on my own, which you need to be an author. The next question. How do you deal with family and friends who feel your writing is no more than a hobby? It's not really important. It's not important whether someone other than me can see my vision. It's only important that I can. The next question. If you had an opportunity to meet any writer in the world, who would that be and why? Shakespeare. Because he wrote for every social group. Every class was catered for. In his comedies, he'd put in jokes for each group, and he put in kind of he put in subtle things, and he put in, quite bawdy stuff, and he put in quite sophisticated things. And also he was a commercial success in his own lifetime, but he still became part of the literary canon, which is a neat trick if you can pull it off. Also Dickens, Charles Dickens, the way that he lifted the lid on culture and said, okay, this is happening on the surface, but look what's happening underneath the surface. But he also, was able to deal with these huge, great themes and make really important cultural comments, but also write silly characters as well, and kind of pantomime characters, which I appreciate. I love Emily Bronte as well, because Wuthering Heights doesn't read like literary fiction, but you can analyse it on so many different levels, and I love picking out the themes and repetitions and all of the literary aspects of it, but at the same time it's just a cracking good story. And I do have a fondness for literature that, for stories that sit on that borderline between commercial and literary fiction. Of living authors, I'd love to interview Stephen Fry properly, because I kind of unofficially interviewed him when I was a student, and it would be great to do that in a more professional capacity. Next question. Tell us a bit about your release, where the idea came from, and how long it took to write. I kind of answered this in the first question, I think, in that I've always been interested in how things work culturally here. But the actual impetus for this story came to me in a medieval literature seminar in about 96. It was a discussion of the oral tradition and the cultural importance of fairy stories, and how this is affected by people putting down concrete interpretations, like Disney did with Cinderella. And it got me thinking about how the oral tradition could easily be reignited if enough people made their own versions of these tales. which obviously since then we've got kind of social networks and people are putting their own voices out there. So the oral tradition has been reignited through things like YouTube. But at the time we didn't have that. And so I decided that I would write my own take on Cinderella when the opportunity arose and, when the moment arose. And time passed and life happened. And then suddenly I found myself living in relative poverty and thinking, the moment has arisen, I must write this book. And I was also inspired by the impact of the wedding of Charles and Diana and how it had been marketed to little girls. And of course, at the time I was writing this, I had no idea that I'd launched the book in the midst of another royal wedding build-up. But it's fascinating that nothing has changed. The marketing's exactly the same. And a whole cohort of girls will grow up to believe that they will marry princes and thinking it's a real possibility and it's going to destroy their lives probably. And, I find that really so interesting, and because the marketing's exactly the same. This idea that there's a commoner marrying royalty and it's a fairy tale. They did the same with Charles and Diana. They did exactly the same. They used the same headlines. Diana was put across as a commoner. She wasn't. She was a lady, but she was put across as a relative commoner. The same thing happened with Fergie. It happens time and time again, and all it is the retelling of this Cinderella story because it's so embedded in our culture. And I wanted to look at why Cinderella is such an important figure when she's essentially got no character. All events are done to her in the story, in the actual Cinderella myth story. She lucks out because she's pretty, that's it. And she's clumsy and she drops a shoe, that's it. So I thought, well, what happens when she either stops being pretty or her feet grow bigger, or she starts to develop a character? And that's where my book starts, except it's not a decade after the marriage, which is because I was interested in what happens a decade after the marriage. It's a decade and a year, and you find out why in the first chapter. It took me about a year to write it. It took way longer to edit. I've written the second book in the series, but how long it takes to release that depends 100% on how well this book sells, because if this book sells well enough, I am totally going to hire in an editor and get it out quicker, because editing is no fun to me at all. Your next question, give me 3 words that describe your book. Intriguing, moving and funny are the words that have come back quite often, so those will do. How would you describe your editing process while writing and also during the process with your editors? I edited it until the very last stage when a couple of beta readers who are also editors gave me some feedback. Personally, I leave editing out of the first drafts. It's a totally different discipline. You need to be creative and then critical. If you try and do them both at the same time, it's like trying to smile and frown at once. You can't do it. The next question, how does your book differ from others in the same genre? I knew it wouldn't fit an existing genre, so I made one up. It's a Cotswold novel. I thought given what I'd worked out about the area and its connection with literature, it deserved its own genre, so I made one. If you live outside England, you can call it an English novel. Where people have tried to fit it into an existing genre, the most common place they put it seems to be quality commercial fiction, which is cool, because I hoped to write something commercial that was at the literary end. Commercial fiction that you wouldn't be embarrassed to be caught reading on a train. I did employ a few kind of chick lit trends, I guess, because obviously one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to continue this kind of Cinderella discussion, and to do that you need to plumb into whatever the persistent kind of viral thing of the moment is, and in literature that's chick lit. That's what spreads fastest. So I basically looked at the pace of chick lit, and it's basically written in that kind of pace, and it's got some of the aspects of chick lit in it that you would expect to find, but I wouldn't call it chick lit. It's there's other stuff going on in it. But it's up to you. It's always up to the reader to define a book, so define it however you choose. And finally, what advice would you give to new writers? Write. Understand that it's no less of a career than any other, and that means that you need to work at it. And you also need to set aside specific time to do it. And also, if you write, you're a writer. Don't wait for permission to consider yourself one. You don't need permission. But if you do need permission, then I've just given you permission. And that's that. So thank you very much for interviewing me, Brian, and if you want to pass on the information I gave you about the special offer that I want to provide for your readers, then that would be great.